I'm going to keep this straightforward because when you're eyeing a gaming notebook, the biggest worry is ending up with a machine that looks good on paper but falls short when you actually sit down to play. That's why I'm focusing on the real-world experience of the Acer Nitro V15.6-inch model, how it feels in a typical daily setup, where the value really comes from, and whether the trade-offs line up with what you need. Link is in the description if you want to check the product details on Amazon. First, let's talk about the hesitation most of us feel. You've probably read a dozen spec sheets that shout 165Hz, RTX 5050, i5-13420H, and you start wondering, will this laptop actually give me a smooth frame rate in the games I care about, or am I just paying a premium for a marketing badge? Will the cooling system keep the CPU and GPU from throttling after an hour of Battle Royale sessions? And, perhaps most importantly, is the price justified compared to a desktop or a higher-end laptop that promises ray tracing at ultra settings? Those questions are the ones I tried to answer by looking at how the Nitro V behaves when it's actually being used for a few typical scenarios: a 2-hour gaming marathon, a couple of weeks of streaming on the side, and the occasional school or work workload. The Nitro V slots a 12th generation Intel Core i5-13420H into a fairly compact chassis, paired with 16 GB of RAM and a 512 GB NVMe SSD. The processor is a quad-core with hyper-threading, which, in practice, means you get solid performance not just in games but also when you have a browser full of tabs, a music player, and a voice chat app running simultaneously. In my own testing, loading up a modern title like Valorant or Apex Legends and then opening Discord and Chrome didn't cause any noticeable dips. The 165Hz IPS panel is a clear step up from the 144Hz screens you see on many mid-range laptops. The extra refresh rate actually feels smoother in fast-pacing shooters, especially when you're pushing the graphics settings to high rather than ultra. You'll see less motion blur and a more immediate response, which is where the real advantage of a 165Hz panel shows up. Now, the RTX 5050 is positioned as a budget-friendly ray tracing GPU. It won't match the raw horsepower of an RTX 3060, but it handles 1080p gaming quite capably. In Fortnite, I was able to keep well over 100 frames per second with ray tracing turned on, and in Cyberpunk 2077 I could run the game at medium settings with DLSS enabled and still stay around 5560 frames per second. That's respectable for a laptop in this price bracket, and it means you don't have to sacrifice visual fidelity completely just to stay fluid. The downside shows up if you try to crank everything to the max in newer AAA titles ** Elden Ring * at ultra settings, for example, dropped into the mid-40s and felt a bit choppy. So if you're someone who refuses to compromise on graphical settings, you'll quickly notice the ceiling. Thermals are often the hidden trade-off in thin gaming laptops, and the Nitro V is no exception. Acer uses a dual-fan setup with a copper heat pipe, which is enough to keep the i5 and RTX 5050 in the safe zone for the first 4,560 minutes of continuous play. After that, the fans ramp up noticeably and you'll hear a steady whine, but the temperature stabilizes around 85°C for the CPU and 80°C for the GPU. In practice, this means you can get a solid hour-and-a-half of high-intensity gaming before you start seeing minor throttling. If you're planning marathon sessions of 3 to 4 hours straight, you'll notice a small dip in frame rates as the system throttles to protect itself. That's not a deal-breaker for most gamers, but it's something to keep in mind if you're a speedrunner or a streamer who wants to push the hardware to the limit. Battery life is another practical concern that often gets glossed over in specs lists. The Nitro V ships with a 57Wh battery, which under normal desktop use browsing, document editing, maybe a light game gives you around 6 to 7 hours. When you fire up a demanding game, you're looking at roughly 2 hours of play before you need to plug in. That aligns with most gaming notebooks in this segment, but it does mean you shouldn't expect to game unplugged on a coffee shop table for an entire day. If mobility and long battery life are top priorities, you might be better served by a thin Ultrabook or a dedicated handheld console. Storage is a practical point that often gets overlooked. A 512GB SSD fills up quickly if you install several modern games, each taking 3050GB. The Nitro V does have an extra M.2 slot, so you can add a second drive later, but that does add a bit of cost and a tiny amount of installation effort. If you're comfortable managing your library, moving older titles to an external drive or uninstalling games you don't play often, the single drive configuration will be fine. Otherwise, budgeting for a second SSD is something you should factor.